London and New York. He is founder and partner of Space Caviar, which is a design and research group that is based in Genoa and works at the intersection between architecture, technology, politics and the public realm. He's also director of the Ideas City program at the New Museum in New York. And also teaches at the AA in London. He was previously editor-in-chief at Domus magazine, so some of you might already know him for that, as well as being director of the Storefront Art and Architecture in New York. His work has been exhibited in many international exhibitions, among which the Venice Biennale, the Milan Triennale, the New Museum, and many others. Joseph suggests that technology is a charismatic roommate from which there is no escape. Tonight, Joseph will take us through his vision of the new hybrid condition we are living in, crypto architecture, exploring the full spectrum of architecture for the body and the city. Give a warm welcome to Joseph Grima. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Matilda, for the fantastic introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here. I have been, for many years, following your work here and been admiring and being curious about the kind of space that was producing that kind of work. And I didn't really have a mental image of this institution, so it's actually really nice to be here to see the kind of spaces that you're working in. And I think in many ways, I'm really amazed by the environment, the energy here. It's really great what you're doing, so I'm really excited to see where you'll go next. I'm here to really kind of present something that's very much in progress, that's very much an experiment that's open-ended, that we don't really know the answer to. It's more the product of a kind of a certain curiosity towards ourselves, ultimately, towards the city, and especially towards in particular towards our homes, to what the home actually represents today. The home, of course, is something that is in many ways characterized by a set, almost like very few other spaces in architecture, of a set of notions and of preconditions that we associate it with, a certain kind of iconicity, a certain kind of symbology that carries with it certain notions of formal notions. For example, in the Apple security settings panel, you'll notice that it's actually a home that kind of is the emblem of security, but also of intimacy, of something kind of primordial, but that is in a way also a little bit kind of even just looking around us, where how many of us in this room actually live in a room, in a home with a pitched roof, like the one on the Apple security settings? I'm pretty willing to bet that almost nobody. And in fact, this is, and so in a way this is something that we're really kind of fascinated by in terms of the work that we've been doing over the past couple of years at Space Caviar, in particular in kind of investigating the home as the sort of elementary particle of the city, something that in fact determines not only the spaces that we inhabit, but also our understanding of the city as a whole, of the way that we actually interact with the city, and the way in which public space is something that we kind of think that we know and that we have an image of, but that in many instances doesn't actually correspond to that image. And in that sense, we're fascinated by this point in which the city converges with politics, with the kind of the expression of the multiplicity, of the expression of the many in space, in the way in which a condition which we've become increasingly accustomed to, that has really spread from, including here in Madrid in 2012, a condition which really kind of brings one space into kind of almost fluidly flowing into the next, from Madrid to Istanbul, and from Paris to Sao Paulo, and to Tel Aviv, and from there all around the world, including Latin America, kind of a condition in which the city is something that is in essence in one place, but in all places at the same time. And in a way, I think this image of somebody who's being medicated by 7 different people, their prime preoccupation actually being their smartphone and communicating with that network, is an extraordinary image that encapsulates the condition of space today. Spaces at the same time in one place and everywhere. You can be at the same time in a riot or in an uprising in the center of Cairo, but also on the subway in Japan. In that sense, also all of these underlying forces that are difficult to represent, that are difficult to see, that in many ways actually kind of flow like currents underneath us and around us, and that actually come to saturate our homes and the spaces that we inhabit, and that propose to us a completely new form, forms that infiltrate from completely unexpected directions, that add new spectra of communication into the spaces of everyday life. And there's something kind of interesting about this sort of a composition of G3 Apple Macs and its similarity with the image that was on the frontispiece of one of the kind of archetypal texts that all of us as students of architecture have been exposed to, which is Logère's, or in fact Essai sur l'architecture is the volume, but and it's Charles Dominique Joseph Eisen on the frontispiece of Logère's Essays on Architecture, which in a way kind of encapsulates this idea of the primitive hut, encapsulates not so much architecture itself, the architecture of domesticity, but that which domesticity represents to us in our minds, almost a kind of a conceptual architecture which exists within our collective consciousness of the home, and which has, we have somehow, that's so irremovable that it has led us to completely lose track of, in fact, or perhaps lose our ability to look with discernment at the spaces around us, the spaces that we inhabit, to actually understand the forces that are acting out on the architectural envelope of the home. And this book, The Quantified Home, which was the product of approximately a year or two of research that was presented at Interior Biennale last year, was really in a way that kind of encapsulates all of the research that led into the project I wanted to talk to you about this evening. And in particular, a set of, the reason it's actually flashing all of these different cover images is because one of the kind of features of the book is, or characteristics is that it's bound in, the fly leaf is actually made out of wallpaper. We bought up all of these kind of leftover rolls of wallpaper. Nobody wants wallpaper that's almost finished because it's never enough to actually wallpaper a room. So it was actually the cheapest way of making a dust jacket for this book. And in the same time, it kind of also represents this idea of the extraordinary diversity and multiplicity of identities that coexist under this single notion of that we understand as home. And this book, which it's essentially a book of essays that take different kind of archetypal models of homes that in some way have been radical or revolutionary in the history of architecture, and attempts to kind of deconstruct them, to take them apart. But it's also driven by a kind of an analytical view of approach to the home, an attempt to actually understand it not only through the kind of subjective readings of all of the authors who contributed to this book, but also the kind of approach that somebody like Thomas Piketty, for example, might take. And in fact, in this particular graph, we were looking at data that was put into the public domain by Piketty in from his research into capital in the 21st century, which looks specifically at the home, in fact, from a point of view of its value within the marketplace. And something that was quite interesting that kind of came along quite early on in this process of analysis and research was the realization that the condition that the home occupies in our in society today, in the marketplace today, in the contemporary culture, is one that it has not always occupied, which is actually something that I think, especially for our generation, for those who under a certain age, is quite difficult actually to perceive even. It's although I guess if the primary window into that realization is that probably whereas most of us will spend most of our lives actually working simply in order to be able to pay off the mortgage on our homes, that's something that our parents were not accustomed to do in many instances. Even in London, where my parents grew up, they had both owned houses before they were 30, and neither of them were rich. Neither of them came from wealthy families, but it was something that was much more part of obviously there were small houses, but still the idea of owning a house today is something that's kind of almost unthinkable before the age of 30. And I think in many ways it's also a problem that the generation after ours won't face either, simply because the idea of owning a home will be inconceivable completely. And so one of the interesting facts that emerged from Piketty's research was, and it wasn't presented in quite this way in his book, so we actually kind of revisited the numbers and kind of looked at this this trajectory of the home and its value within the marketplace. It's quite interesting to see how over a period of industrialized economies, and primarily Western economies, in a period that spans from the colonial era to the present, the home has, or real estate in general, not only the home, also one could kind of factor in office space and so on, but I would say that the home as the primary driver of this has come to occupy a primary position within the cumulative wealth of a country. The primary asset of a country today, even in, such as Spain, for example, will be its real estate. It's actually not going to be, which is something that is inversely proportional if you look at these graphs, which are, I can't actually read them because they're a little bit too small, but they're primarily US, UK, Germany, kind of Western economies, most of which were kind of part of the colonial. I think France is in there as well. Actually, this one's, the top right-hand side is Germany. The middle right-hand side is USA, Canada, and so on. Anyway, it's pretty clear what's going on. There's a kind of an inversion of centrality of real estate, of built work, of architecture essentially, with the value of land. So value of land kind of falls off a cliff, and the value of property rises exponentially. And another a piece of data that's also kind of notionally obvious, but that is quite interesting to look at statistically, is the speed at which different strata of society have grown over time, the kind of capital wealth of the top 5% or 10% and the bottom 10%, for example, which, and this is also something that empirically we all know, that, to kind of put it bluntly, the rich are getting richer while everybody else is pretty much staying the same. In fact, this isn't the top bottom 10%. It's even more interesting because it's the middle 10%. It's essentially the middle class measured against the growth of the top 10%. And of course, if you took the top 1%, that would grow even more sharply. The disconnect would be even sharper. Then again, looking at the value of a single square meter of land, for example, in different parts of the world, this is actually taking 50,000, in fact it's looking at the other way around, it's looking at what $50,000 will buy in different cities of the world. And down here we have Cairo, or Dar es Salaam is the biggest square, Cairo, compared to certain cities of Western Europe or North America, where the square gets too small even to see, so we actually had to kind of magnify it down here on the bottom left. That's actually 10 times larger even, to compare. And so there's this kind of extraordinary divergence of value between land depending on where it is around the world, which again is something that we're empirically familiar with. And in this graph we were attempting to look at, in fact here, to really kind of start to look at the influence of technology on the home. And so through this this kind of stairway that moves across here, is kind of looking from 1000 BC, the first time that's actually a flushing toilet. We all think the flushing toilet was invented in Victorian Britain. It wasn't. It was actually invented in China well before the birth of Christ. And then kind of looking step by step to the supply of drinking clean water to the home, or to wastewater being taken out of the home, or the flushing toilet, the gas lighting, for example, here. I might just gas lighting here, all the way up to kind of electric lighting coming in here, the telegraph, and so on. Obviously, right then up to the arrival of electricity into the individual home, the supply of gas. The idea of the home as both a destination into which things are progressively shipped, into which things kind of come, the home as part of a network, but also the home as a terminal, a place of origin of information. And of course, the point that arrives at first is the telegraph. Very few people had a telegraph in their home. Very few people were actually sending messages from their home. That was something that tended to happen at the post office. But of course, since then, with Minitel and with, needless to say, that, well, the telephone, obviously, and the arrival of the internet, the home has actually become increasingly, the flux is in the opposite direction. The home is actually increasingly becomes, throughout the kind of unfolding of history, a point of destination, a point of origin of data, a kind of one could say, effectively a factory of information. And so this is just the beginning of starting to look at the way in which this notion of the home is something that has mutated and evolved, possibly even beyond recognition, one could say. The rise of certain companies that have had the ability to intercept that which effectively the home is today, that which we actually genuinely know empirically. The idea, I think many of you, I was being told before that you all come from 45 different countries around the world and that have moved to Barcelona to be at IAAC. Of course, IKEA was central to that. IKEA is the design company for the nomadic generation, for the generation that has no attachment to the home get the clicker out. No attachment to the home in the canonical sense that that it was understood traditionally, perhaps by our parents, for example. And so IKEA is kind of, in a way, the substitution for an idea of architecture which is structured around Loget's idea of the primitive home, of this kind of pitched roof, iconic structure that we all know. Oh, sorry. How do I do that? Here it is on the side. Thank you. Sorry about that.
This one.
This one?
Yeah, this one.
Oh, no, I wanted to advance the slides.
Okay, so no, sorry. You didn't want it before, so
okay, cool. Sorry. I'll keep clicking forward to... and then, if it's too much trouble, don't worry. It's okay, I can click it. Oops. Okay, a slight interruption of... Yeah, okay, we'll try see if that works. Yeah, it does, beautifully. And this is kind of also kind of intersects with certain other things, like the rise of certain these companies into our collective consciousness, becoming cultural icons in themselves. So IKEA, sometime around the year 2000, actually had the dubious glory of becoming the IKEA catalogue became the most published book in history, overtaking the Bible with over, I think, something like 5 or 6 million copies published, printed each year. Or no, it must be more than that. I think like over 100 million printed each year, something of the kind. Some exorbitant number. So there's kind of very interesting sort of inverse proportionality to the decline of religion and the rise of IKEA. And I think that it's no coincidence that is connected to an incredibly lucid, cold and detached, the ability to observe the world from a point of view that nobody else is actually able to capture. And in a way, I think that's summarized in a way in this a slide which was part of the IKEA reports on the city, which are freely downloadable. I don't think they got as much recognition as they should have got. But these incredible reports that really take a very lucid look at the way that we live today. And they're divided into 3 chapters: morning, lunch, and dinner, or morning, kind of noon, and I can't remember exactly how they call them. And they released the morning one first. This is from kind of I think they call it Waking Up. And the lunch one isn't quite as interesting, the kind of midday one, but the waking up one is incredibly interesting in its ability to capture the reality of how we live space today and how certain technological devices, primarily these guys, have completely changed not only the structure of our interactions with other people, but also the relations with the space, the way that we actually use our own homes. And so, for example, this poll that they did in London, the reports are structured through investigations in 6 6 different cities. This particular slide was looking, they asked employed Londoners whether they had worked from these spots in the home before they go to work. So people who have jobs who had worked from the bed, the bathroom, the dining table. And this fact that they were able to put their finger on the fact that 12% of employed Londoners work from the toilets before they go to work is something that I think would almost, I just find it extraordinary as an architect, as just kind of like, think of the possibilities of this, think of the way in which this is completely transforming our deterministic notions of space, the idea that space has a function, that rooms serve a purpose. What is a living room even? What is an office? How do we even go about thinking about the home in this time? And I think in a way, a lot of this points to questions that have already been asked. There's nothing actually new about these questions. They're questions that we simply need to look back into our memory in certain years of the 60s and 70s of what design specifically, architecture as well, but most specifically design. For example, this group of radical architects from Milan called Global Tools, Sozza, Sugola Pietra, 9999, UFO, a lot of the kind of radicals of that time were really thinking about the way in which we needed, in order to be able to inhabit the city, in order to be able to coexist with these technologies that are completely transforming our lives on a daily basis, we have to equip ourselves with a new set of tools. We are simply not equipped to be able to inhabit the environment through what those notions of architecture and those notions of space that we inherited from our parents. And of course, these technologies are incredibly exciting. I mean, if you look outside and look what you guys are doing with 3D printing earth and clay and making buildings out of that's incredibly interesting. But
these in your own home using what's called a three-dimensional printer. This sounds like science fiction.
We also need to think about
it's not so far-fetched.
The bigger picture of this. Like, how is technology transforming our lives in a completely different way? What is beyond the kind of the polished aesthetic of 3D printing and the curvaceous forms that we architects are making? How is this actually completely subverting our lives within the city, the spaces that we actually really inhabit, and also thinking about the kind of the limits of technology, the way in which these dreams have all been dreamt before, and that we actually have hit so many walls in the past. We've had so many glorious, magnificent, utopian visions for our future that actually ended up in nothing. And so, in a way, what we're trying to think about is what are these tools that allow us to address the problem of space today, the problem of living in the city? How can we turn this problem, in a way, into an extraordinary opportunity, and while allowing, and primarily really thinking about how this can occur without actually becoming enslaved by those machines, essentially, with those technologies that are actually offering us the possibility of a completely different vision of the future. And I think that kind of an interesting starting point for that is really to kind of think about like looking at the city the way that machines look at city, obviously, and thinking about the way in which the kind of the geographies that we're so familiar with mean something completely different when you look at them from the perspective of a machine. But also kind of looking at some of the kind of fundamental notions also from a legal standpoint, from a juridical standpoint, from a standpoint of the kind of the fundamental structures that are already being transformed within in the environments around us, the way in which transactions will be mediated by machines, in which the idea of a centrality, a central institutional entity that regulates relationships between us perhaps will cease to exist. And again, these are ideas that are not necessarily new. If you think about Constance and New Babylon, this kind of epic 20-year visionary utopian art project, essentially, much more than an architecture project, was really an attempt to think about the way in which the city could become the repository for or the space of enactment of a completely different understanding of human relations, in which architecture was the framework not so much for a traditional notion of ownership or a traditional notion of rootedness and existence and domesticity and so on, but in which actually the shape of the city reflects a completely different set of relations between people. And I think it's kind of amazing and interesting to think about the way in which that has Constance's vision, which of course we all love to go and look at Mark Wigley's beautiful book about this sort of the architect as impersonator, as Mark calls him, has actually been largely realized, but in a completely different form. It's like this idea that we actually drift around the world, seamlessly hopping from airport to airport and being in pretty much any space at the same time, is multiple spaces at the same time, is essentially, this could in fact be a diagram of New Babylon. And then, and at the same time, of course, when you kind of zoom into the field level, to the ground level, you realize how actually the structure of the space around us, the architecture itself might not have changed, but of course the landscape in fact has changed. Even though those changes might be invisible, they're revealed to us by those machines that increasingly mediate our relationship with the space. And Airbnb, like what more than Airbnb can actually illustrate this rise of nomadism? I think I was reading some statistic that I think some ridiculous percentage of San Francisco is actually on Airbnb. I think you can pretty much stay in 9% of the city, at least in probably talking about the more kind of central neighborhoods. But the fact that 9% of the city is actually devoted not to a single kind of conventional notion of habitation, but it's kind of out there drifting in the public domain, and that photographs of it online, and that you can kind of hosting opens up a world of opportunity. And how does this then translate into in terms of relations between us? What are the rituals, in a way, that underpin the space of domesticity, as they always have? Domesticity has always been driven as a kind of a stage, in many ways, for these kind of rituals of domestic exchange and of... and so this is kind of some of the questions, is to kind of think about this completely subverted notion of privacy, because ultimately the home, looking at it, I think as Le Corbusier puts it, a kind of very fundamental definition of it is related to the notion of privacy, of actually being able to kind of seclude oneself, or kind of given the choice of being able to draw a curtain, to actually cut oneself off from one's surroundings, from one's neighbors, from the scrutiny of society. And how does that translate into a reality in which there can no longer be an expectation of privacy, in which anything that you do, increasingly it's very difficult to do anything that is going to be not mediated by the internet, and anything that's mediated by the internet is going to end up on the internet. So how do you escape from that? What is the kind of structure of a society, of a city, of a family, in an age in which all information essentially is public? What are the new kind of rituals that defend us against our fridges, which are going to be kind of taking part in spam bot parties with some other part of the planet while we're not looking? Not to mention kind of, or potentially kind of getting its own back on you. And this is, and I think it's kind of interesting to kind of think about how, I don't know if you're familiar with this image, but it's Rainer Banham and Francois Dallegret. Well, Dallegret did this beautiful drawing to illustrate Rainer Banham's text, A House is Not a Home, from 1965, in which he really kind of looks at the rise of technology and technology shaping the domestic envelope, and the kind of the increasingly prevalent idea of architecture as an assemblage of technologies that regulate a certain space. So Rainer Banham kind of conjures up this imaginary machine, which he kind of calls a sort of Baroque assemblage, which essentially condenses all of those technologies into a single, rather mysterious artifact that is capable of dominating any landscape of any kind of space. So you can kind of imagine it on top of a rock, with you being able to kind of dominate the landscape, vanquish the landscape, and transform it into a habitable. So this is essentially kind of this sort of obviously quite tongue-in-cheek proposal for a domesticity of of high technology, which kind of is applicable anywhere. And of course the reality is that the envelope hasn't changed. The envelope hasn't become a machine or an assemblage of contraptions that regulate our environment, but nevertheless technology has seeped to an almost extraordinary level into the home, in which we are actually in continuous, even simply through our movements, through choice of actions that we take, that we enact on this stage of the home, we are essentially we are shaping our environment, and the machines are watching us, they're looking at us, they're observing us, to the point that we could almost say that the home is possibly space in which we have the least expectation is becoming the space in which we have the least expectation of privacy, even less than outdoors. Of course, theoretically, this information is not in the public domain, but that depends on your definition of privacy. If privacy is simply that which is not in the public domain, or if it's ending up in data centers in 5 different continents, every single action, a record of every single activity that's taken place, can you still consider that space a private? And how is this becoming in itself an economy? What are the kind of economic implications of this? Why, how can you actually, what is the economic model behind all of these devices that we bring into the space of domesticity? And of course, there's also, we have to take into consideration a cultural shift in which, in fact, we have almost, through a series of sort of collective rituals in which certain very innocent actions like Instagramming our cat can insert us into a completely different landscape that we never even imagined existed, such as a global landscape of cats, where there's somebody clicking random cat and zooming in on your cat in Medellin or Bogota or wherever you may happen to be. And so this information's out there, it's interpretable, it can be aggregated, it can be grouped, it can be parsed, it can be synthesized in all sorts of different ways. Is it a problem? Maybe, maybe not. It's a question. It's something that's interesting, but it's a question that needs to be asked. That's fundamentally the point. And I think, as kind of from the architectural perspective, what's interesting is to really think about the statement of Le Corbusier's, the kind of the notion of the home as a shelter against the elements, the rain, the cold, the wind, and the inquisitive, and to think about the wall as an architectural device that has pretty much, since architecture has existed, been the mediator of those things. It's something that's been a kind of a barrier or an opening, a curtain that we could draw across or a curtain that we could draw back. But of course, the wall is something much more complex than it's ever been today. And if you look at, if you search for the wall, you'll realize that in fact it's something that's even been dematerialized, that the wall is like the firewall, or there's just it's become part of a kind of a linguistic translation into something that actually defines our life much more, which is the settings of Facebook, for example. The wall that is most kind of discussed, or that we think about primarily, is our Facebook wall. And of course, Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg himself, resolves this problem of mediating his relations with his boundaries by buying everybody else. But that's probably something that most of us can't do. And so the most that we can, our kind of greatest expectation of privacy is possibly to blur out, have the image of our homes blurred out on Google Street View. And of course, then there's a completely different level in which the accelerated pace of technological innovation is offering a completely different set of tools to all sorts of people, primarily the police, and authority has now a set of instruments at its disposal that it has never had before, that are really kind of challenging in the US the First Amendment, of actually being able to consider one's home as a barrier from any sort of warrantless search. And so this is where, kind of considering all of these things and thinking about this notion of the home as a productive site, as a site of habitation, as a site of ritual, where we began to think about what it would mean to construct or to envisage a home with an airplane mode, something that actually has multiple states, something whose state is not single or can be defined in any moment, but that responds to this idea of full spectrum architecture, something that goes well beyond the, it is kind of interesting when you think about this definition of the wall as a barrier, as a boundary, as the kind of mediator of signals, that in fact we're usually, as designers, considering a very thin spectrum, which is that spectrum of visible light and perhaps sound. But of course that, compared to the full spectrum, is almost nothing. This is where all of the activity is happening now, on the the level of microwaves, of radar, of radio, of broadcast. This is where increasingly our identities reside, and the identities of others, and through the points at which this kind of mediation with our surroundings occurs. And so this kind of led to the question of what actually constitutes a wall. What is the kind of performative nature of a wall today? And I wanted to read you a quick text that was really kind of crucial in being able to kind of unpack some of these ideas and to make this translation from the social into the architectural. And this is a text by Robin Evans from 1971, which is called The Rights of Retreat and the Rights of Exclusion, and it's published in a book called, I think, Translations from Drawing to Building, a collection of essays by Robin Evans. And he kind of begins by saying that this article will attempt to chronicle in a rather anecdotal way some incidents in the environmental history of the war against information. It will deal with a strange way in which human beings render their world inhabitable by circumscribing and forgetting about those parts of it that offend them. Then he goes on to say, this view, which equates the flow of information with psychic disintegration and danger, has never been entirely submerged by more optimistic interpretations of social interaction. There have, after all, always been people who regard their life's work as the expulsion of alien perceptions. And this is where it really becomes he very quickly kind of makes the bridge into the sphere of the political, the way in which the home, the way in which all architecture is essentially a form of editing, it offers the possibility of editing one's surroundings, of creating some sort of selective version of reality, effectively. And he brings the very interesting example of the book by J.K. Huysman, Against Nature, in which this figure, Désessant, who is in fact a kind of a proxy for the Comte de Montesquieu Fezensac, completely furnishes his home with only items which are black, because that was his kind of obsession with the world. And of course, that's a kind of a metaphor for the idea of architecture as the composition of a reality that corresponds to one's own understanding of reality. And then he kind of goes through this essay, kind of unpacks a whole series of different notions and applications of the wall as a way of shaping reality. And kind of comes to the conclusion at the end that nobody has seriously approached architecture from this direction, possibly because it is, in the end, the route that induces most cynicism. For though in the manufactured world is seen to be the prime stabilizing force in a universe of for through it in the manufactured world, therefore architecture essentially, is seen to be the prime stabilizing force in a universe of tacit mutual misapprehension, misinterpretation, and misanthropy. So in a way, all architecture is making a very subjective statement about one's surroundings, is mediating the kind of the projection of an ego, of an identity onto its surroundings. And so this was kind of the point of departure for looking at a way in which a home, and this is a very short clip from the film Fortress of Solitude, which was part of this project, a short movie that kind of looks at the home and its relation with kind of identity and the kind of the home taking on an identity of its own.
Opinion.
Oops, that's not in there. And really kind of trying to understand what the possibility of architecture that really kind of embraces this idea of the wall as something that is essentially an extension of the identity of its inhabitant, and that offers the inhabitant a certain power to also dynamically control the performance of the building in its context. And this kind of, especially kind of Fortress of Solitude, was really kind of started a lot of these. This is a series of images that was culled from social media that was part of the book, The Quantified Home, that was really kind of looking at the way in which people use space within the home, in which this kind of idea of the deterministic, the kind of the end of space, the deterministic notion of space completely falling apart. And so kind of really trying to kind of observe with the same lucidity and detachment that IKEA has, the way in which we look at the home and how these kind of multiple functions could become part of our living environment. And also the way in which kind of different, YouTube, if you look on YouTube, there's this extraordinary whole genre of cat videos, GoPro, the cat cams they're called, in which you can actually explore people's homes from the perspective of a cat. or also the way in which a kind of a different sort of ritualism, which is the ritualism of robots in the industrial workspace, can also characterize our own. It could be something we could be leveraging, kind of taking into for ourselves into the notion of furniture, for example. Why couldn't it be hybridized? Why does it have to be something static? Why can't it be something mobile? And why does furniture in the first place have to be something even that we own? Why can't it have the same sort of borrow this idea from the logistics center of Amazon? And that's, of course, something that's already happening around us. And I don't know whether you've come across this startup called Airbnb that allows you to rent a bathroom for 10 minutes. And I think this is kind of
providing
this kind of
free public Wi-Fi in India is no monkey business, and authorities are facing that reality in the holy city of Varanasi. Varanasi was the first of about 2,500 locations to be provided with free Wi-Fi in February 2015. But within 2 months, authorities are now facing a formidable challenge in the form of monkeys. Varanasi is home to macaque monkeys, which live in temples and are fed by devotees. But they're now also feasting on fiber optic cables. Cables strung along the banks of the river Ganges had to be replaced less than 2 months after being installed after they were chewed by the monkeys. Authorities are now looking for a more permanent solution. They can't move the temples. The city is already built up and crowded, which means that they cannot lay underground cables. And trapping the monkeys is not an option either, since it seems to outrage temple goers. Wonder if Modi ever thought that monkeys would come in the way of his grand IT plans. From New Space Social Center Bureau in Hyderabad, Anant Manohar.
So there's something kind of incredibly beautiful about this idea that actually the smart city has to face the problem. The greatest obstacle to the advent of the smart city is monkeys chewing on fiber optic cables. And of course, needless to say, as soon as Simone actually found this video, so that's going to be our field trip with the students at the AA, because we need to check out the kind of the progress of the smart city firsthand. But yeah, there's something about this kind of the adding this cultural dimension, the dimension in which, in fact, often the weight of history and the layers of serendipity and of unpredictable obstacles end up being actually the most fascinating, the richest field in which we as architects can respond. And that's, I think, something that increasingly we really need to make an effort to do, because this the infiltration of us, the seduction of form and that the technology brings with it, can lead us to kind of leave behind this whole idea of of Homo ludens and this experience of the city, which is much less deterministic, allows us to really experience space in a way that is fundamentally unpredictable. So anyway, going back to this idea of the wall as something that mediates relations between interior and exterior, that's also the site of paranoia, that's the site increasingly of insecurity, that we're really not sure what's actually going on the other side, and also this idea of our kind of social media. This is another of the images that was taken from Flickr that somebody had uploaded, goodness knows why, I don't know what the context of the situation was, but the kind of increasing willingness to share these incredibly sort of intimate moments of domestic space led us to kind of really think about how also what the possibilities for the architectural envelope were. And here I have, I'm sure I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to read you one more text, which in a way is and then I think we're very close to being done. But this is an extraordinary project by Ugo La Pietra, one of the architects who took part in the radical movements in Milan, and who was part of this amazing exhibition in 1973 at the Museum of Modern Art called Italy, the New Domestic Landscape, which was really looking at a set of really kind of a turning point, I think, in the history of architecture and of design of domestic space. And he proposed this object, which he describes as the counter design as postulation, 1972, and it was kind of this sort of very iconic form, which again kind of takes this notion of the pitch roof and the site of iconography of domestic space, but also translates it into something, into a device for the mediation of information. The project's more extensive, there are other parts of it as well, but this is one that kind of has the ability to create a space that adapts to its surroundings and to the media that are actually being employed by its user. And he writes that through the making thinking of this particular object, my aim has been to point out the necessity at this historical moment of reproposing the problem of a direct knowledge of reality, overcoming the barrier or instrument seen as a connecting filter between us and reality. And then he goes on to say, so then this is kind of figure 2, going beyond the neo-Luddites who destroy or utterly refuse the use of information and communication tools, having identified them as the instruments of power and the symbol of the programmed capitalist society in the negation of man's freedom, my proposal is designed to express the will to use the means of information and communication, keeping them, however, under control, i.e. not by undergoing their presence either as an objects or instruments, destroying their design and assuming their evolution only as regards their technical, mechanical, and electronic features, using them furthermore in such a way as to overcome the barrier which these means set up between us and reality. And so I think the incredibly interesting point that La Pietra is making is that we are not forced to make a choice between the possession and the use of technology, or a kind of a neo-Luddite condition of refusal of that. But that actually we have the possibility of enacting a series of new rituals, of making a choice in the way, in the moments, the times, the places, the way in which we interact with these devices. And so this kind of led, also kind of in reference to La Pietra's project of 1972, and this kind of research into the condition of the home, to a project called Ram House, which was a kind of a speculative response, and that's by no means finished. It's a work in progress. It's kind of still an experimentation. But it really kind of attempts to start from a completely fresh slate, from a kind of a tabula rasa of domesticity, in which we don't kind of start from the presence of the pitch roof necessarily. But more importantly, I think the pitch roof in this instance is not so much the kind of the formal device that we're attempting to escape from, but more the ideas of what actually, especially around the wall, what constitutes the architectural envelope, what actually constitutes the condition of the home today, and how can this condition of proximity with information, this sort of continuous interaction that La Pietra is referring to, how do we mediate that? What is the process through which architecture is actually engaging with that and empowering us especially. And so the RAM house is essentially, RAM comes from radar absorbent material, which is the material that encases this upper level, the first floor, which is conceived as the bedroom. And so the house is completely structured around a completely different notion of wall, a wall that is not a separation from the exterior necessarily on the visual spectrum, but that it offers the occupant the possibility of a set of different modes, one of which is airplane mode, in which one is completely segregated, separated from the exterior, in which one's smart fridge cannot leak data, can't take part in spam bot parties, nothing can happen. One is simply, it's like the equivalent of drawing the blinds at night time when you're going to bed. Another is an open house mode, in which a certain set of features are enabled, in which one's kind of presence in the ether is partially enabled, and another is open house, in which everything is possible and the boundaries have been completely removed. And this is partly also kind of made possible by a completely different understanding of what the room is, for example. It is no longer a deterministic space in which only one certain activity can take place that's designed specifically for that, but that we were working with the company Procos Mobilrot, based in Südtirol, who make these. A lot of their products are actually kind of for storage and different kinds of arrangement of space. So they were kind of the natural partner for a kind of a model of domesticity that was hyper-condensed in many ways, and that's also kind of adaptable to a set of different conditions. And so these shelving units, for example, which are on rails and that can be cranked into position to reveal a different set of functions, the function of the living room, or the function of the kitchen, or the function of the office for different moments of the day, based on the premise that in fact we generally only use one at a time. And so this is the kind of prototype that was presented last year at Salone Mobile in Milan, which is essentially kind of, it's almost a capsule in many ways, but it was really, the prototype was mostly attempting to experiment the possibility of the relationships between the interior and the exterior, the idea of what could be kind of this interstitial space, the idea which is also kind of deeply rooted in Italian architecture of the veranda, and being in a condition which is neither indoor nor outdoor, but there's a kind of somehow in between the two, and also the possibility of new rituals and new kind of proximities between people that would, and also kind of like what are the possibilities for vegetation and for growth of that kind. And this was the second implementation that was actually in Genoa, in the gardens of the Museum of Contemporary Art Villa Croce, where we kind of actually added a second feature, which was the roof terrace, and started to look a little bit more at also its kind of relation with its surroundings and so on. But it's kind of an itinerant project that's got no conclusion, and that conceivably will evolve into something completely different, but it was mostly an opportunity to kind of begin to think about the spatial expression of some of these ideas. Thank you very much. Do we want to have some questions and answers, or?
So I was about to say that.
Great.
So does anyone have any, well, thank you firstly, Joseph. Does anyone have any questions for Joseph? No questions for Joseph? Yes?
You've got this notion of privacy as being a negative aspect to it, but have you ever considered as it's not only a taking, like the open source of the data that's out there? You can't continuously take, but you always have to give back for progress. So having an airplane mode would kind of stop or prevent the progress from happening all the time. And I don't know about everybody else, but I don't think my life is that interesting. So you can have all the data that you want. But I think it's the notion of the privacy is going to change over time. And the more and more that people think the privacy will be less, the more it can progress. Like, for instance, if you're worried that someone is going to rob your house or do something malicious to you, then you can, if you have the data of that person, you can also counteract, or the police can counteract those intentions.
It's a really interesting point that you raise, actually, because I think it goes straight to the central core of the problem at hand, which is the political dimension of information, which I think is something that's kind of not obvious and that can be very easily overlooked. But it's a little bit like one of the very common responses when I guess when Edward Snowden leaked all of this kind of vast cache of data about the activities of the NSA and GCHQ and so on, and a lot of people said, well, if you've got nothing to hide, then what's the problem? I've got nothing to hide, so you're welcome to my data. Or like you just said, I don't do anything interesting, so you're welcome to my data. And the problem with that is it's a little bit like saying, well, I've got nothing to say, so I'm not interested in the right to free speech. And there's kind of some fundamentally flawed, I think, in the notion that your data doesn't hold interest for anybody simply because there's nothing specific that's being looked for, or that you haven't done anything, or that you're not doing anything interesting. And I think the problem fundamentally lies in the fact that the aggregate of your data is essentially, whether or not you're doing anything bad, that's kind of almost like beside the point, is offering ultimately power over you, whether you realize it or not. And that power might not always be overt, it might not always be completely manifest to you, but the ability to aggregate every instance of your identity through multiple platforms and to take that as and to kind of collate that into a single image it essentially cuts out preemptively a number of scenarios that you might not even know right now you might in the future be entertaining. And for just to kind of give one, the most kind of brutal and blunt and least probable scenario, if, for example, whatever point you decided that you were no longer happy with the political condition that characterizes the country that you live in, and you decide to become an activist, anybody who is in possession of all of that data then, about you, it's not they're going to send a hit squad, but it becomes almost impossible for them to not be able to discredit you instantly, simply by also just taking, even if you've done absolutely nothing wrong, if you're one of the few people in the world who has never done anything that they wouldn't be happy with being viewed publicly, taking that information out of context can actually completely demolish your public image. And that's something which, again, kind of take it once, take it twice, take it 5 times, it's not a problem, but you take that for the whole of society, you automate that process, it becomes incredibly problematic. And so even simply by ultimately, I think the problem, as La Pietra points out, is not a kind of attitude of neo-Ludditism in which we attempt to kind of escape any sort of surveillance or escape any sort of collection of information about us, but it's the totality, the all-encompassing nature of that access to that information that in the aggregate is extremely problematic. And so we need to think about what, not necessarily that we, this ultimately isn't a kind of a proposal for a sort of individual shield. It's more a kind of actually an opportunity to have these conversations than anything else, because of course, as we know, the shape of architecture, the form of architecture, the idea of architecture as we understand it is very unlikely to change, and it actually boils much more down to a sense of individual responsibility towards the devices that we use, and the kind of the policies that we enact in our daily lives. So yeah, that's ultimately the aim of the project, as opposed to advocating that anybody should kind of seriously move into a Faraday cage.
Any more questions? No? Yes? Hold on.
Hi. My question is related to the RAM house. And I was intrigued because today you have explained it as a bedroom that I have always seen these beautiful images of that neutral space that it looks like kind of tatami, super abstract, hang it in the middle of a shelf. So the shelf was basically kind of a system that enveloped nuclear space. And today you mentioned that it was a bedroom, and it shocked me.
Well done, you caught me out.
I would like to.
You totally blew my.
No. I would like.
You see, it's like it's pervasive. It's very difficult to get away with. You have a bed. It's a bedroom. It's like that's the way we're programmed. And
yeah, I was surprised because I really thought that it was not useless, but without a program. So I wanted to ask.
No, it's just kind of a slip of slightly kind of like the concentration waning. But no, it's absolutely, the whole point of the whole space is a kind of a programless, non-deterministic architecture in which anything is possible. Yeah, of course, I think there are certain spaces that are useful for certain things and not for other things. But it's completely attempting to kind of circumnavigate, so well spotted.
No, sorry, just...
Thank you for rescuing me from my own assumptions.
Because the idea of the technology, that it's the one that gives the use at the end to the space, it's super powerful. It's a compliment at the end.
Thank you. You push me, so are you able to work from the toilet of the RAM house? No, I have another serious question. No, I'm wondering about the scale of the project, how you envision a city-scale project in airplane mode, for example, now that we depend on technology for a lot of urban activities and connecting these issues. So just a speculative question, how you can scale this?
It's a really interesting question. Again, it kind of goes to the ultimate finality of the project, which is the RAM House was really more an attempt to engage with the kind of Loger's essays on architecture and the idea of the archetype, and was never really intended as serious. It was more intended to kind of problematize the use of space and kind of also really kind of consider space as the stage for a kind of a domesticity, as a kind of, with the performative dimension of domesticity in a way. And therefore, as a sort of the primitive hut is by definition something that is removed from context, it's removed from, it's kind of idyllic by nature, and so that's why we love the idea of it being sort of in the trees and in the forest and being in the absence of any other inhabitant. It's almost a sort of survivalist structure that kind of goes back to the idea of the safe room. I think ultimately the question is, it kind of is a little bit like Cedric Price's idea of architecture, that is not about building bridges, but it's about getting to the other side. And I think I can actually see very few ways in which the problems that we're facing, which is the kind of ubiquitous infiltration of sentient devices into every space of existence, is something that won't be solved technologically, it won't be solved architecturally, it'll be solved socially and culturally. And so again, I think this is more kind of an opportunity to consider the way in which we employ the spaces that already exist, as opposed to necessarily needing to transform them into something else. Because I think ultimately the kind of lesson of history is that that's not going to happen anyway. So any proposal that attempts to seriously be kind of, well, it's also like it kind of goes back to that rather problematic habit of architecture of being a sort of solutionist discipline that kind of thinks that there's an architectural solution to every problem, which is absolutely not the case. So in this case, I think ultimately the solution is definitely not architectural, and it's much more cultural.
Thanks, Joseph. That was like very, very inspiring, and you were touching a lot of aspects of the influence and the impact of technology in architecture, in space, in communication, in principles like privacy, property, many, many things. I was very much shocked by the slide of the end of space, and I was thinking that I have the sensation that all these technologies, the information and communication technologies, and the possibilities that we are having, is basically not so much limiting the space or ending it, but rather extending it in another dimension. No? I was expecting also to see some examples of augmented reality, for example, which is another kind of means of how we can experience space, or how we can interact with the space in the blurry lines and limits between the physical and the virtual, no? That goes far beyond the smartphone, or that goes far beyond the more, let's say, traditional technologies. And I think this kind of vision of augmented reality is really going to bring a radical impact on the houses, on our architecture, but also on our urban spaces. My question, around all this, is that taking all this into consideration, thinking of what is the role of the architect, or what is the future role of the architect, what should be the future role of the architect? Are we supposed to keep on designing, let's say, final objects, final products, in whichever kind of scale? Or is it about rethinking of what an architect is designing in terms of process? Should we design relationships rather than products? Should we design software instead of hardware? And if that is so, how we can start influencing also other aspects of our life? No, you were talking about culture. You were talking about the Airbnb, the sharing economy. The fact that I can rent my house is actually a contribution on another kind of a different thinking of how the economical model on the cities are functioning. So the way that we build our space, or our framework for space to happen, is influencing as well other kind of disciplines. So what is the role of architect then?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of really interesting, and it's something that I would have liked to unpack a bit more, is this question of the relationship between the kind of impact of technologies on space. And so, for example, taking Airbnb, Of course, it's fantastic. There are extraordinary opportunities that are being opened up by this technology, but it's really also, I think, becoming increasingly evident that this project is not something that's happening in isolation, but it's actually part of a historical trajectory towards an extreme, a kind of an increase of pressure on the home in economical terms, and a mutation of the home itself, of what we understand as home, as a consequence of that. So, for example, in 1979, or the kind of early 70s, in fact, was a crucial moment in, or kind of, it was between, there were a number of historical events that occurred between the early 70s and the late 70s, including the collapse of the energy crisis in the US, a series of other things that had quite precise impact on the home. But one of the most interesting things was that Fannie Mae, which was the biggest bank, the bank that of mortgages, which was essentially a state apparatus that there was essentially a bridge allowing families to be able to pay over a kind of relatively, for the poorest especially, it actually became an independent company on the free market. And that corresponded to a moment in which the home passed from a condition of sort of being a utility, so to speak. I think it was really the moment in which I was speaking about before, that kind of separates us from our parents, in which the home, as opposed to being something that one would kind of save up and buy, is something that you would buy and then save up for the rest of your life. And that was mediated by the fact that the mortgage industry essentially ballooned from something tiny that only helped those in direst need to something vast, in which almost everybody was in need of a mortgage to be able to buy a home. And of course, the consequence of that was that the home not only was, what Fannie Mae essentially was able to do was to introduce to the market a home of a completely different level of cost. People were able to buy homes that they'd never previously been able to afford, simply because the mortgage market wasn't structured the way it is now, so that everybody could actually be able to access it. And in a strange sort of interesting kind of paradox of history, Airbnb is in many ways part of the same trajectory, in the sense that Airbnb is, through technology, and just as the way that Fannie Mae, through the kind of the technology of the marketplace, if you like, certain kind of networked communication systems, and also the kind of design of financial systems, made possible something that was not until then possible. And the same is happening for Airbnb. Now Airbnb can actually extract even greater value from the home, to the extent that we're able to afford even more expensive mortgages. The market can absorb even higher prices of the home, and that is essentially putting us under that home that we were able to afford until 3 years ago. Now we have to rent out the bedroom because we simply can't afford to keep it any longer. And so I think it needs to be really kind of looked at from both perspectives. And I think that, of course, many of these things are fantastic, but they're also problematic. And I think that, of course, it's very easy to be extraordinarily excited and optimistic about the future of VR, for example, or augmented reality, or whatever you like to describe it. But of course, it's very easy to see how that is going to become one more instrument in the hands of the market, in order to be able to extract even greater value. And when you no longer have that sort of physical, psychological need of space, then essentially that kind of adds another 10% of opportunity for contraction. I don't know if you've read Millennium by J.G. Ballard. It's a fantastic story about the kind of the absolute compression of space, literally the end of space, to the point that every citizen has the right to 4 square meters, and then through the course of the book that kind of collapses to 3.5 square meters, and so on. So I'm kind of interested, because I think there's also far too little of it, actually kind of projecting onto the space of the home the kind of consequences of technology, as opposed to looking necessarily at the possibilities, and also not kind of necessarily taking a negative view, but I think also kind of thinking a little bit more about the aspect of collective responsibility, and what we politically and socially desire for the future, like what kind of spaces do we want to live in? Do we want to live in an ultra commodified city in which every square meter of space has the value of that we're essentially going to be enslaved to? I don't think there's any single answer to that, and it's not as kind of simple. The question isn't that simple, but I think nevertheless we need to spend a little bit more time talking about that side of it.
Just one last question. Linking with Areti's concern about new possibilities of the design profession, and linking to your crypto-architecture concept that I think it's really suggestive, this possibility of a full spectrum architecture, don't you think that is something narrow to keep using the same metrics like square meters or the same language, that it shouldn't be desirable that if we are exploring new fields, also explore new possibilities of new metrics and also a new language for design and architecture, instead of trying to explain the complexity for work in terms of square meters or let's say a currency. I don't know, it's only an idea that maybe it's time to start using also new languages. That you have any idea if this could be a possibility also?
You could say that throughout the course of the 20th century, the JPEG compression algorithm was applied to the home. That's you're kind of putting it an interesting way. Yeah, what if space could essentially be read through a series of different metrics like gigabytes or Newton power, force, or.
We're saying that is another new way. When we talk about that new.
Exactly. That's actually, I should point out that the Tumblr at the top is the Tumblr of our unit at the AA, with which I'm teaching this year with Pernilla Orsted and Simone Nicki. And we are kind of looking at this idea of also kind of, in a way what you're talking about, Cesar, of how the kind of economics of the home, kind of looking at the home as an economic question. From kind of just to take one, we kind of look at the financial, the economic model of the single home, and for example, taking this idea of data as the new oil and kind of extracting value from the actions that play out in our homes. How could that actually be something that we capitalize on, that we actually exploit, as opposed to simply it happening behind our backs in Google's server farm somewhere in Idaho, and thinking about that as the kind of part incorporating that into the business model of the city. So homes that have cheaper rent because, for example, they're kind of making use of your data, or the sort of Snowden model, which is ultra cut off from its surroundings, but that has much higher costs because it's running independently from the sort of monetization of your activities. Or and we're kind of looking at the idea of apartments, kind of taking the sharing economy model in which ownership no longer exists, and looking at the idea of apartments that actually own themselves. So kind of taking some of the ideas of Bitcoin and the blockchain, the kind of collective, some sort of collective decentralized register of ownership, and the idea of the apartments owning themselves and running themselves on different business models. So kind of offering the marketplace choice between the extraction of data from its inhabitants, or ultra security, or and then kind of looking at the hybrids of that, so the kind of Facebook model versus the Snowbook model, and so on. So yeah, that's that's where we'll be posting stuff throughout the year.
Any more questions? So thank you, Joseph, and maybe we can take the opportunity to do another round of applause for Joseph. And now for the beer.